Hello, and thank you very much, Edward, for inviting me to contribute to what will be a very interesting presentation on this relatively unknown work by Handel. I will give you an overview of the historical Xerxes, and because this is a vast subject that could fill great heavy books, indeed which has filled small libraries over the past few thousand years, you'll forgive me if I don't say as much as I could. I've uploaded to Google Classroom a full set of the slides that I will show you, but I will hurry you through them, looking only at the high points in a most eventful life, and in a life which is somewhat different from the kind of life you might imagine if you only know Xerxes from the plot of Serse. In the Handel opera, Serse comes across as, on the whole, a rather amiable character, somewhat given to rages, but these rages are easily appeased, whereas the historical Xerxes is somebody probably best not approached. So with that being said, allow me to share screen with you. Here are the notes, and can everybody see these? Let me go, there we are. There is a picture of Xerxes at his moment of what he thinks will be his greatest triumph. He is looking across the straits that separate Asia from Europe. He is going to invade Greece. He is going to fulfill his father's last wish. Indeed, he is going to advance the strategic boundaries of the Persian Empire deep into Europe. As he says in the great speech that you see in Herodotus, when Greece is conquered, the borders of Persia will be the sky and the sea, and nothing more than that. Sadly for him, though perhaps rather luckily for us, it didn't quite work out like that. Now there is a timeline of the life of Xerxes. He was born in 519 BC, give or take a year or two. He was the eldest son of Darius I and of his wife Atossa, who was a daughter of Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus was the man who created the Persian Empire. In 486, he becomes the great king following the death of his father Darius. In 480 BC, he invades Greece at the head of a vast army, which I'll discuss in a moment. At first, all goes well. He reaches Athens, he sacks the city. He then waits for the other Greeks to surrender. They don't surrender. They instead trap him into a naval battle in the Bay of Salamis, which he loses. At this point, the invasion collapses. Xerxes has to scuttle back to Asia. The entire invasion falls to pieces and is a notable disaster. Indeed, there is a case for calling it a catastrophic disaster. After the failed attack on Greece, Xerxes withdraws to his palace in Persepolis and spends the rest of his reign involved in beautifying the great palace at Persepolis and keeping peace in his harem, until one day, in 465, he's assassinated by Artabanus, the commander-in-chief of the royal bodyguard, and it seems that his eldest son was involved in this plot because Artaxerxes I subsequently becomes the great king of Persia. So that is the timeline, very abbreviated, of a most eventful life, a most eventful and a most violent life. This is the empire over which Xerxes ruled. This is the empire that he inherited from his father Darius I on his death. And here in the west, you can see that the Persians already have a slice of Europe. They've already moved in, and they have a border on the Danube. Indeed, they're slightly beyond the Danube. They have already turned Macedon into a satellite state of Persia, and many of the Greek city-states are already inclined to give in. If the Persians invade, they will not offer serious resistance. But let's go back a bit. Long before the Persians thought of invading mainland Greece itself, they had taken over the Greek-speaking cities of Asia Minor, the Greek-speaking cities on what is now the western coast of Turkey, cities like Assos, Smyrna, Larissa, Ephesus, Miletus, and Magnesia. These are Greek-speaking cities. They had been occupied by Greeks since the middle of the Bronze Age. In the 6th century BC, they fell under Persian control. The Persians were not bad rulers. They tended to devolve power as low as they could. The basic deal was you pay your taxes, give a few men as often as we want to fight a war. Otherwise, we'll leave you alone, just govern yourselves. The Greeks, however, didn't like that deal. The Greeks wanted independence, and in 500 BC, they began a great revolt against the Persians, a great revolt in which the Athenians were persuaded to take part. The Athenians marched inland, and they burned the provincial capital, Sardis. The great King Darius was enormously angered by this, and he swore revenge against the Athenians. And so, in 490 BC, Darius did send a small invasion force across the Aegean to burn Athens. This was defeated, surprisingly defeated, at Marathon in 490. Darius was disappointed, but not greatly enraged. He decided that a proper invasion of Greece would require greater attention than he'd given to the last one, so he began to prepare a much larger invasion force. Then, however, revolts broke out in Babylonia and in Egypt, and he spent the rest of his life, until 486, putting down those revolts. When he died, there was a brief power struggle, from which Xerxes emerged as the great king. Xerxes finished putting down the revolts in Mesopotamia and in Egypt and in various other parts of the empire that had tried to throw off Persian control. And then, in 481, he decided the time was right for the great invasion of Greece. Xerxes commanded all the governors of his vast empire to gather together as many troops as they could. Hundreds of thousands of troops from all over this great empire were poured west, and they met at Sardis, the provincial capital, the rebuilt provincial capital. The historian from whom we have virtually all that we know of this invasion, Herodotus, says that the Persians had an army of about 3 million. That is unlikely. You can't lead an army of 3 million. Even nowadays it's unmanageably large. In the ancient world, no, it's just not possible. But if you divide most of the numbers given by Herodotus by 10, you get something fairly likely. So we can say that Xerxes led an army of 300,000 men away from Sardis towards Europe. The plan I've given here was to march north from Sardis, to cross the straits there, and you'll see in the opera by Handel that there is a reference to the bridge and to the destruction of the bridge by a storm. Xerxes would march his army across the straits on a specially constructed bridge. They would then swing round the coast, down through northern Greece, making straight for Athens. They would take Athens and burn it as revenge for the burning of Sardis. In the meantime, there would be a large Phoenician and Persian fleet operating to carry supplies and information to the Persian army on its march south. As soon as Athens was taken and burned, Xerxes thought that would be the end of the war. The other Greeks would give in, mission would be accomplished, Xerxes could withdraw, and he would have added another province to his empire. It would advance Persian power into Europe. It would also stop a source of instability on the western borders of the Persian Empire, because the Greeks were a most turbulent, unruly lot, always at war with each other. Great empires don't like turbulent and unruly neighbours. Their tendency is to conquer them, and so the Persians wanted Greece for a number of reasons. The story is that when Xerxes reached the Straits, he ordered a review of his great army. He sat on a gold and ivory throne overlooking the place where his 300,000 men were marshalled. At first he was very pleased to see so many men, and then he burst into tears. His uncle Artabanus, not the one who murdered him, his uncle Artabanus was standing beside him and said, "O great king, why do you weep?" And Xerxes said, "A thought has struck me of how short is the span of human life. These many men so beautiful, and 100 years from now not one of them will be alive." So you might see a certain human touch in Xerxes. It's not a human touch that lasts. Xerxes had ordered a bridge to be constructed across the Hellespont, across the Straits. This was done by Egyptian and Phoenician engineers. Unfortunately for them, very unfortunately for them, a storm blew up and destroyed the bridge. Xerxes now gave way to a fit of rage. He sent men down to the Hellespont with whips and branding irons, and they scourged the waters and branded them, crying out, "Oh, you wicked salty waters, how dare you destroy the bridge which your master Xerxes has built across you? But we say that whether you like it or not, Xerxes will cross you." And having done this, they threw sets of manacles into the water and withdrew. Xerxes then took the Egyptian and Phoenician engineers who had built the first unsuccessful bridge, had their heads cut off, and ordered a new bridge to be built. And this was a bridge made from the ships of his navy, assembled side by side so that a causeway could be built across them, joining the European and the Asian coasts. And across this new bridge of boats he marched his 300,000 men, and then the plan went into action. There are the dramatis personae of this great war between East and West. There on the left is a Persian representation of Xerxes. There is Themistocles, the leader of the Athenian assembly and the man who did most to stop the invasion. There is Leonidas, one of the kings of Sparta, who didn't do much to stop the invasion, but he did do something that inspired the survivors to stop the invasion. And there is Pausanias, the Spartan general, who eventually mopped up the Persians and cleared them out of Greece. And there, to continue the dramatis personae, there are the fighting forces. On the left, you see a Greek foot soldier wearing about 70 pounds weight of wooden, iron and bronze armour. These men were not enormously mobile, and when you see that helmet to his left, you'll see that visibility was greatly impaired when they were fighting. But as long as these men fought in a line, and as long as they kept discipline, they were pretty well unbeatable. On the right, you have a Persian soldier, and don't be deceived by those rather soft and gentle-looking pyjamas. It looks like a child's pyjama suit, doesn't it? These were very deadly soldiers, not very well armoured, not protected, but they were mobile. They would dart around on horseback, shooting arrows at their enemies until they were softened up, whereupon foot soldiers would attack them. These were the two forces arrayed against each other. What is the Greek plan of defence? The Greeks just can't match the Persians. The correlation of forces is massively against them. But the Greeks do have one weapon, and that is knowledge. Xerxes is leading an army of 300,000 men. It is not possible to supply an army that size from the land of Greece. Greece is far too poor to provide food for an army that size. Navies at this time were too small to bring supplies to keep this army provisioned. It is necessary, therefore, for Xerxes to bring the majority of the food that his soldiers will eat with the army. That means that Xerxes is operating to a very strict timetable. He has to reach Athens and burn it before the end of the summer, preferably long before the end of the summer, and then he has to take the submission of the other Greek cities and get himself and his great army, or the majority of his great army, out of Greece. There are not enough Greek men or ships to defeat the Persians in open battle, but if the Greeks can slow the Persian advance down for a few weeks, the advance will collapse. The Persian invasion will have to be called off. The first Athenian plan, then, is to try to stop the Persians near Mount Olympus, Athenian Plan A on the map. When the Athenians and the other Greeks looked at the mountain passes around Olympus, however, they realized that it wasn't a very good stopping place. It was too porous, the Persians could go round it. Plan B, therefore, was to stop the Persians much further south at the pass of Thermopylae, a much better place because you have a chain of impassable mountains to the west and the sea to the east, and just 150 yards width of land through which the Persians must move. If a Greek army can hold the Persians up there, that might cause the invasion to collapse. The Spartan plan, and the Spartans were not the most public-spirited and certainly not the most generous of the Greeks, the Spartan plan was to defend the isthmus at Corinth, which would mean that the whole of northern Greece would be abandoned to the Persians, but the part of Greece that the Spartans themselves occupied might be held safe. Massive argument at the League of Corinth, where the Greek city-states gathered to decide and to coordinate their action. Eventually, the Spartans agreed that they would send a small army north to Thermopylae, and this army would be joined by other Greek contingents, and they'd hold out there. And to show faith, one of the Spartan kings, Leonidas, marched north with just 300 bodyguards to wait for the other Greek forces to arrive. Sadly, the Persians were moving very quickly. They arrived at the pass before anybody could expect it. And so for 5 days it was necessary that the Spartans, just 300 of them, should hold back this army of 300,000 Persians. At first Xerxes was amused by the sight of this small Spartan force. One can't call it an army. He waited for 5 days, and then as he realized he was running out of time, he ordered his men forward to clear these Spartans out of the way and to bring them alive to him. The Spartans marched forward and cut the Persians to pieces. At the end of the day, the Persians had lost thousands of dead. They hadn't broken past the Spartans, they certainly hadn't arrested the Spartans, and they withdrew. And so this went on for day after day after day, for 5 days in fact. Xerxes was so distressed, he was so angry, that several times he stood up from his throne, worried for the fate of his army. Indeed, Xerxes liked to watch his battles. He didn't lead his men into battle. He would have his throne placed on a high point, surrounded by his courtiers. He would then watch the battle, and he watched this with rising anger and humiliation. At last, however, a Greek traitor, a man called Ephialtes, sold Xerxes some very important information. There was a small goat track leading through the mountains. It would be possible to lead a small Persian force which could come down behind the Spartans and then attack them from both sides. On the 5th day, the Spartans got up, marched forward, and realized that they would now be attacked from behind, and this was the end. They withdrew to a small hill, and they fought and fought. When their spears were broken, they fought with their swords. When their swords were broken, they fought with fists and teeth. The Persians withdrew and showered them with arrows until all of them were dead. The Persians now rolled forward. The Spartan defence had been a work of the utmost heroism, something that has inspired historians and everyone for the past 2,500 years, but it hasn't stopped the Persian advance. The Persians advance on Athens. There's a plan of Athens as it was somewhat later, but it's not very different in 480. The Athenians wondered what they were supposed to do. They sent off to Delphi to ask for advice. The priestess sent back the message, "You've lost. You'd better abandon Athens, go west and start another city in Italy." The Athenian assembly wasn't pleased by this. They sent the envoys again, telling them, "Stay in the temple, refuse to leave until you get a better oracle." So the priestess sent back, "Well, if you look to your wooden walls, that might be enough." The oracles given from Delphi were always somewhat ambiguous, so the Athenian assembly argued for quite a long time over what this one meant. Themistocles, one of the leading men in the city, argued, "It means we evacuate the city and we fight the Persians on sea." Other Athenians said, no, what we do is we put a great big wooden palisade around the Acropolis. That's our wooden walls. The Persians can't break through that. There's a picture of the Acropolis I took last October. It is pretty formidable. But Themistocles got his way. Most of the Athenian population was evacuated to Salamis and Aegina, islands across the Saronic Gulf. A small force of diehards held out on the Acropolis. The Persians broke into Athens, burned the city, took the Acropolis, killed the defenders, burned the temples, destroyed all the statues, and that was the end of Athens. There is the Critias boy. You'll see this boy in the Acropolis Museum. It's one of the statues thrown down and smashed by the Persians, found by the Germans in the 1860s. The next day, however, the day after Athens fell, various Athenian exiles who'd been following along behind Xerxes asked permission to go up to the Acropolis to sacrifice. Xerxes was feeling rather guilty about having burned so many temples, so said, "Oh, of course, go ahead, go and do your religious rites up there." The Athenians went up to the Acropolis and they found that the sacred olive tree, the olive tree sacred to Athena, which had been burned by the Persians, had miraculously sprouted overnight, and there was an 18-inch length of green growth. When Xerxes was told this, he was troubled. But Xerxes sat in the ruins of Athens, and then in Piraeus, the port of Athens, for quite a while waiting for the Greeks to come and surrender. They didn't come and surrender. All that happened was that the Greeks were getting their naval defence ready. So Xerxes decided to finish the invasion by seeing off the Greek fleet. At this point, Themistocles, the Athenian leader, sent a private message to Xerxes. "I've changed sides. I'm on your side now. I'll give you some important information. If you sail into the Bay of Salamis and attack the Greek fleet, you'll find that it's completely unready for battle. You can finish this war in one morning." Xerxes rubbed his hands. He knew the Greeks were a treacherous, backstabbing lot, and it didn't surprise him that one of the leaders was selling out. So he ordered his entire fleet to enter the Bay of Salamis. Sadly for him, the Greeks were waiting, and they sank his fleet. There is a representation of Xerxes sitting, as was his accustomed way, on a high place on his golden throne to watch the proceedings, and Xerxes has to watch as his fleet is burned to the waterline. And that's the end of the invasion. Xerxes has lost control of the sea. He's running out of food, the Greeks haven't surrendered, the invasion has failed. So Xerxes has to get himself out of Greece as quickly as possible with as many of his men as he can. He leaves a small force, 100,000 men, that's not small, but it's small as a proportion, leaves it with his brother-in-law Mardonius, but Xerxes has to hurry his men back the way they've come, and this time the food runs out, and people start to die of hunger and disease. When Xerxes gets back to the straits, he finds that the second bridge, the one of boats, has been destroyed by a storm, and it's necessary to ferry his men across the straits. On his own journey across the straits, a storm blows up, and Xerxes turns to the captain of the ship and cries out, "Is there no way of saving us?" And the captain says, "Oh, I'm sure there's a way of saving us, but the ship's too heavily loaded. We need to lighten the weight." And he looked at the courtiers standing around Xerxes. Xerxes turned to the courtiers and said, "Will you do nothing to save your king?" And so the courtiers bowed low, walked to the side of the ship, and jumped over into the dark waters and drowned. That lightened the ship, which was brought safely to shore. Xerxes rewarded the captain with a golden crown for having saved his life, and then cut his head off for having commanded the death of so many good Persian nobles. This being done, Xerxes and the remnant of his army, a pitiful remnant of his army, got back to Sardis, and it was a pitiful remnant of his army. Even in Sardis things didn't go well, because the men who had been starved for so long now stuffed themselves with whatever food they could get, and they would quite often die of excess. So Xerxes limped off back to his capital in Persepolis, where he lived out the rest of his life in reasonable peace and quiet. He taxed his people very heavily, because he wanted to beautify the palace at Persepolis. Other than that, he involved himself in harem intrigues, keeping peace among his concubines and the eunuchs. And so his life carried on down to 465 BC, when he was murdered by the head of his bodyguard, another man called Artabanus. And that was the end of Xerxes. You might call him a blood-stained tyrant, you might call him a tragic figure. You can see both of those in the history by Herodotus. Don't think you'll see in the descriptions of him given by Herodotus anything approximating the character of Serse in the Handel opera, which is what I think what Edward means by the humour in the opera even before it begins. So there is a brief overview of the life and times of King Xerxes. The long-term legacy is that the Greeks, led by the Athenians, were able to push the Persians out of the Greek-speaking areas of Asia Minor, and there is the Athenian Empire at its height, this great ribbon of yellow that goes around the coast. That was the Athenian Empire, and that was the area within which Greece enjoyed its golden age of the 5th century BC. Oh, there is what remains of the serpent column in Istanbul nowadays. For about 1,000 years it adorned the hippodrome at Constantinople. This was put up in Delphi by the Greek city-states which had pulled together to resist the Persian invasion, and if you lean forward over the rail you can still see the names of the Greek cities written on the base of the serpent column. That is our last physical contact, not with Xerxes himself, but with the times in which Xerxes lived. However, this is a session about music, not about history, so I've given my piece and it's back to Edward.